Zichronal Bracha, Fania Gottesfeld Keller, Zichronal Bracha, renowned author and lecturer on Holocaust, loyal friend and partner of Matan. Her yard site is this Wednesday with Beth Fitzroy. And the Akedah, which whenever I approach it, I remember what Kierkegaard writes in his great essay on the Akedah, Fear and Trembling. He says, countless generations have known this story, but how many has it rendered sleepless? And it's all very well to know the story, but if you haven't been kept up awake at night thinking about it and worrying about it, then you haven't begun to know it. You don't realize what you're reading. But there is fear and trembling here. There's something here that's almost impossible to engage with. And indeed, I do find I have sleepless nights and especially this year, it's all part of something we're all going through, it seems to me. Part of the trouble is perhaps that, as emerges, not even God's command is all clear. God says, Ha'alehu lo'olah, take your son, your only son, on whom you love, and offer him up. Ha'alehu lo'olah, offer him up as a sacrifice. We read that automatically. The ha'alot is to offer a sacrifice. And then it says olah, so that makes it clear. It's a burnt offering sacrifice. And then Chazal come, and Chazal are not, they don't play with the text without responsibility. There is something there that they're trying to say. And they say that at the end of the story, God tells Abraham, when it's all is sort of over, so he says to him, Abraham comes with all kinds of objections to God, have a lot of protest. Why did you put me through all this? You know that I love you, you know, and so on. And moreover, how could you tell me to kill my son? You know, when I know murder is forbidden, for instance, that's one of the arguments that's used. And in a way, that's the good news. That's Abraham's whole mission in life, is to bring the news from God, from a single God who encompasses everything, that ethical behavior is an important thing. That's what God wants. Kavod Shamayim, the Ishbitz line called Kavod Shamayim, is the honor of God in the world. And that means behaving properly, behaving according to the laws of ethics, behaving as a menschlich. You know, that was the Chiddush. That was the new idea that Abraham brought to a pagan world. And we're going to explore that pagan world to some extent now. What is it that Abraham is struggling with in that world? And so Abraham has a lot of protests to make to God. How could you tell me to do such a thing? It's just incredible. Literally incredible. Is it really you? Is it really you who's telling me this? Already there's that sense of going a little crazy, you know. And God answers him, and if this doesn't make you crazy, then nothing will. God answers him, oh, but I never told you to slaughter him. I said, ha'alehu. You brought him up, now take him down. Now, I'm not fair here, you know, I'm reading it in a sort of flippant tone, you know, with God really pulling it, you know, not playing fair. It's a very serious statement. God is saying, ha'alehu, you jumped to a conclusion about it. You gave it a metaphorical meaning. The literal meaning of ha'alehu is just, that's right, you're right. But, you know, there are different ways of interpreting texts. You emphasize one thing, you emphasize the other. It's a legitimate, in a way, a legitimate answer. It's not a common sense answer. Common sense would say as you do. But it is a legitimate answer, but it leaves you shaking. You mean it was all a kind of joke or a misunderstanding? Now, there's something in the nature of this story that asks for understandings like this, that in some way there's something confusing, certainly to Abraham, and that's what we're going to be exploring, for Abraham and to what he had done in the world, his whole task in the world, about this culminating what is called nisayon in the world, that God had put him through 10 tests. Now that already is confusing, you might think. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I think there really is something in this idea that it's a very, very famous idea that certain events in Abraham's life were not just events, but they were tests of Abraham. And according to various different lists, the lists go a little bit differently from each other in the language of the Midrash. Certain episodes are singled out, starting with the original, starting before Lech Lecha, actually. You have to go back before Lech Lecha, or casting. We'll come to that. And culminating in Lech Lecha. And then even Chazal themselves sort of protest about this. And they say, as if there's a kind of protest that arises from the world. Are you satisfied now, God? This 10th test, this is the one you really want Abraham to fulfill because all the others are inclusive in some way. You have a God who can't believe, apparently, that Abraham is really worth trusting, that he is a good object for God. In Midrashim, in the Midrashic sources, there is a slight retranslation there. Handle it a little differently. They say, no, God doesn't need to test Abraham, but he needs an answer for all those troublesome, troubling, critical voices that arise from the world. Why Abraham? Everyone is sort of testing Abraham. Everyone is looking at Abraham and saying, so what's so special about him? And God needs an answer to that. Now that in itself, I just find such an intriguing idea that what people think has to be taken seriously. That God takes seriously all the nonsense that people think. Now, it's very easy just to say it's nonsense. Or God is a God of tzedek. And if people have qualms about the stories of the Torah, moral qualms, ethical qualms, then it's up to God in some way to have a good answer, not just to say, well, I know, I don't need to test him. So the tests, in a way, are not for God himself, but he needs an answer in earthly terms to point to something and to say, look what he did. And then he just keeps testing more and more till the Akedah. Now, all that, I didn't mean to get into this material right away, but we'll come back over it. But it gives us a feeling of confusion. And that Abraham is in some very deep sense confused, navoch. That's the Ishbit's word for it. Mea Shiloach and his son Bet Yaakov will use that word. When it came to the Akedah, Abraham was navoch. He was full of many.
This is a word they're using?
Yes, navoch.
Amazing.
Yeah, well, it's rabbinic Hebrew. Yeah. Like mavoch.
Yes.
In a maze. And that is
him.
Sorry?
We have in in Sefer Shmot.
Yes.
We have
Nevuchim in the Midbar. So Nevuchim is to be lost in a maze. But here it's emotionally, meaning cognitively, emotionally. That's the Nisayon. The Nisayon is to live through a state of dire confusion. And to do what with it? In other words, Avram is not just a kind of teacher's pet who comes out squeaky clean from the test. He's just wonderful. He walks in, he does the test, it's happy. It's not like that at all. That Abraham, even in last week's parsha, where he was engaged, as we said last week, where he was engaged in the act of Lech Lecha, the process of Lech Lecha, which has a symbolic meaning of go to yourself, go to the making of yourself. That enter into a process of generating a real subject from yourself, someone who is capable of making decisions, someone who has become like Adam, the ideal Adam that God wanted to create at the beginning of time when he said, Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmeinu kidmutenu. A man who is in the image of God. Now, that impossible ideal, let's say imagining of God, since I'm interested in imagination, that in a way, what it is. Now, I said Adam surely is, why does God have to say it? God just has to make whatever he wants to make. in some way, he has to put it out there into the world in words. And he has to say, my project, as I imagine it, is a thing that will be like me. What does that mean? We talked about that last week. So from the beginning, the project is fraught with questions. And Abraham is engaged last week. We had I think it was a very happy share, because it was about creativity, and it was about the use of small amounts of evocative liquid essences, either water or dew, small drops of dew, or even smaller micronized drops of perfume that go out into the world and irrigate a thirsty world. There's a world out there that is thirsty for what? For Abraham. And Abraham is thirsty for Abraham. Avram is thirsty for Abraham. So when God says to him, Lech lecha, go make yourself, go towards yourself, become aware of yourself, tir'eh b'atzmecha, look at your reactions. Notice how different they are from other people's. These are the things we talked about last week. It's a kind of reflexive attention that Avram is now supposed to pay, not to the world out there and how wonderful the sun and the moon and the stars are. That's all very well. But ultimately, the real thing is, look at you. Look, that you deserve a bit of astonishment and adoration, and at least astonishment. Pele, that's the word that the Ishbitzer uses. Look at yourself and your reactions. And now, then last week we were engaged in these fruitful, generative images. And this week, in a way, we're on the underside of all that. What lies beneath all that? The darkness, not water, but fire. Right? The fire of the Akedah, for instance. The idea of living, exploring, allowing oneself to become different because of the anxiety of things, because of the uncertainty of meaning in the world, because of the uncertainty even of God's meanings, right? Apparently he has a privileged relationship to God, and if God says do this, it's simply a matter of obedience. That's the way we learn it in school. That it's a matter of obedience, and he had faith and was obedient and so on. In the view that I want to be exploring, which is very largely from the Ishbitzer, but we'll see, it's all over the place once you look for it. Abraham is not sure of anything. He's not sure of himself, first of all. He doesn't know where he stands. He doesn't know why he is the way he is. It's that kind of very modern question, of the individual who asks herself, I see what I'm like, and why am I like this? I'm not altogether happy. So what we want to be exploring now is the image of fire as a kind of symptom of a world of sacrifice, human sacrifice, which is the world that Abraham lives in, the implications of all that, and then the role it plays in his personal life, the image of fire. An image, I'm again quoting Gaston Bachelard, who I quoted last week, if you want, Bachelard. If you like this kind of material, highly worth reading. So in a book called Water and Dreams, and actually it's Air and Dreams. Air and Dreams. He has a number of books in which he takes an image and he explores it in words. That is, what does this image, what kind of words does it release in me? And he himself says that we should, when we are moved by an image, we should ask ourselves, what is the torrent of words that's unleashed by that image? That is, it's one thing to be kind of affected by an image, and then to sort of, that's not enough. That's just an image then. That's on the edge of idolatry. what one has to notice is what one immediately wants to say about that image and its effect on one. What does it make one think of? You know, it's a kind of associative process, which is a human process then, of putting things into language. In any case, for Bachelard, the problem is how to detach an image from the all too stable background of our familiar memories. An image comes somehow as a memory of something you either liked or didn't like, and has very definite, clear meanings for you. And the thing to do is not to leave it as a kind of idol, you know, as a fetish there, but to detach it from its context and to start working with it, to start thinking, what is that to me? What does it translate into for me? Which is a certain kind of question. It's a way in which to explore one's own mind. And the question is that a worthwhile thing to do, to explore one's own mind? I think one always finds people who are quite dedicated to denying that it's a worthwhile activity. You know, it's overthinking, and so on. And here, yes, I'll quote Bion, Wilfred Bion, one of the great English psychoanalysts of the earlier 20th century, Bion. In one of his books, he talks about the strange and maybe even perverse interest that some people have in, let's say, when you're listening to the radio to a beautiful concert, and then there is static and interference in the old days, on the line. You know, you can't hear well. Instead of trying to listen to the beautiful music, these odd people are interested in the interference. But they regard the interference as intriguing, the turbulence. And out of that comes the creation of the radio telescope. In his days, that was the great invention, through which you could listen to the heavens. You could listen to the sound of the heavens and hear the interferences. And the interferences tell you, for instance, that there is such a thing as a black hole, right? That's a purely human. How do we know there's a black hole? We've never seen a black hole, as far as I understand it. I could be wrong. I don't think it's a visual experience. Apparently, it's an auditory experience. You know, you create it in your imagination. Scholars do, and scientists do, to explain what they're hearing. And so there is that sense of listening to the heavens and of understanding that one should have a respect, he says, for the turbulence and the interruptions, you know, in one's own mind or in the mind of others, to have a certain real awe at what seems to go wrong. Yeah, not necessarily in a pathological sense, but just why am I so troubled by this? You know, I can't help myself, but all the things I can't immediately put into a pretty picture and say, oh, that explains it. Now, all that is part of human life, and Bion thinks that that's a worthy subject of study. When Avram travels to the Akedah, he journeys for 3 days. And then he sees it. Why did it have to take 3 days? Rashi asks. God could have made Hara Moria be something, and it wouldn't be Hara Moria, it would be his backyard. You know, just go into your backyard and sacrifice your son. Why not? Why did God give him 3 days to travel? Thinking about it. And he answers, Shelo Yomru. Again, that expression that people shouldn't say. It's a great figure in the Midrash. People shouldn't say. Who is people? People shouldn't say God shocked him into obedience. Hamamo ve'irbevo. Now listen to those words. Lehamen, hamum, is to be stunned, drugged, knocked on the head. And that made him confused, irbevo. into obedience. He went and did it under the impact of the shock. No, God wanted him to have shehut lehimalech and libo, to have the delay period, to consult his heart, to listen to his heart and speak to his heart. Lehimalech. It's a dialogue. To understand, to make friends with his own heart, of his inner life. What do I really feel about this? Where am I in relation to this command? It's not like a machine of yes, no, and I'll do it, I won't do it. It's a question of how you're going to do it. What are you going to bring with it, or what's going to stop you doing? Not necessarily just perverse disobedience. It's a complicated question. And he gets time. In other words, God didn't want him to go mad under the commandment of the Akedah. He wanted him somehow to get to know the territory of his own inner world when he comes to do it, if he decides to do it. Somewhere that's opening up a kind of liberal space. It's really kind of unexpected in a way. It's a very liberal metaphor that Chazal Rashi is using here, and it repeats itself. I would just say, to quibble a little bit, that maybe having time to think about it could really drive you mad. It's a different kind of madness. It's having too many thoughts. Yes, there's this, but there's that, and getting to know one's own mind is not necessarily clarifying, at least immediately. Sometimes it takes time to get to some clarity. So we have difficulty here. What is the symptom in Abraham of suffering from a habit of mind which is inherently troubled? It's open to trouble. This man of chesed, this man of love and connection with people and outward going, as we saw him last week, wanting to nurture and be nurtured, and so on. The underside of that is a man of hirhurim. That's the rabbinic word for it. He's a man of troubled thoughts. Hirhurim, the double. Hirhurim. Like not a specific thought, but always a kind of afterthought about things. For instance, let's have a look as quickly as we can at the sources on your page that touch on that. Number 1, on chapter 15, Perek Vav, Pasuk Aleph, God says to Abraham, after the battle with the 4 kings and the 5 kings and a tremendous military victory has been achieved, and suddenly we read, God said to Abraham, Al Tira, don't be afraid. Why would Abraham be afraid? That's it. He's the victor. But Abraham apparently always will find room for what's called lira. Now, yira is the opposite of what he stands for. He stands for this chesed, outgoing, connective thing. But it seems as if Chazal are very aware that there is always the opposite of what one officially stands for. The self you have chosen, there is a counter self somewhere that goes to the making of yourself. So here, Abraham, the question now is, so why is he afraid? And if we look further in the text there, in chapter 15, you'll find it goes on to have God promise Abraham the land, and Abraham saying, Ma titili, what are you going to give me if I don't have children? So, but that doesn't explain why he's afraid. So that sort of stands as a question that hasn't been answered in the text. What is he afraid of? Nothing rational. It's not really a rational fear. And here the Rabbi Levi has 2 different readings of it, and then the rabbis have a third reading. Rabbi Levi said, because Abraham Avinu was mitpached, he was afraid, but in the hitpa'el form, meaning it's an odd kind of fear. It's not fear of something. it's an inward broiling fear. It's an anxiety. It's something that kind of goes round and round on itself. It consumes itself. He was anxious, and he said, right, it's kind of difficult to define mitpached. It's a state of being, which is not specific to an object. He was in anxiety, and he said, Tomar, would you say? Now, I think that Tomar is very indicative. That is an Avraham word, Tomar. You'll find it all over the place in the Midrashim about Avraham. He begins his thoughts with a Tomar. Tomar, it relates to what we said before. Tomar is it possible to think this way? And now I'll think of the opposite of the conventional meaning of what's just happened. All right, the conventional meaning is I have a victory, I should be happy, nothing to think about. Suddenly there is that, what can I say, Jewish mind. I mean, not only Jews have it, which somehow second guesses. Yeah, but if I push on it a little bit, I mean, if I press on it a little bit, who knows what I'll come up with. Would you say, for instance, that I've killed so many people just now? You know, I killed many people, and there was one tzaddik among them. I killed a tzaddik. I killed someone who was blameless. And he's afraid. He's anxious. You know, everything's turning now in him. Where am I then? It's not clarity. And God reassures him. I don't want to go into the reassurance, although you're welcome to look at it yourselves. It's disturbing in itself. And that's a subject for a different year, because there I would really have to focus on this. But he reassures him. So it seems that to get God's reassurance, you need to be in fear. You need to be in anxiety. Only if you are in anxiety you ask, let's say, the ethical question, in this case, what if there were a tzaddik? Will God reassure you? Now, is it better to have gone through this process or never to have had thought altogether? You just accept the surface of things. This is how it is. I've won a victory. The second suggestion of Rabbi Levi. All right, I've killed all these kings, but maybe they've left little princes behind them. And they'll grow up, and there will be a regional explosion against me. You know, they'll all come in full force. Now that's a pragmatic anxiety. And God again comforts him. It has to do with Anochi Magen Lecha. Those are the next words in the Torah. I'm going to protect you under all circumstances. So you shouldn't worry. Well, that's kind of the lowest level of it. It's a pragmatic concern, you know, but that is in a way most rational to foresee the future now and say, what did I do? Oh, I really just, what's the word? Escalated. You know, I've escalated the whole situation. The third one is really the odd one out. Again, the same expression, mitpached. He was anxious. And he said, there's no tomar, there is a tomar. But first he says, I've had miraculous salvations, 2 of them in my life. One was Kivshan Ha'esh, the fiery furnace, at the beginning of my life, which is that mysterious episode that you will not find in the Torah. There is no evidence that this ever happened in the Torah itself. It's a pure midrash, right? It's a case of a midrash that has very little to support it in the text. That little we'll look at later. What is there that supports it? And perhaps find that it's not so little in the terms that we're using now. But here it's taken as history. In the midrash, it's history. That's what really happened. What's the story? Remember? Now, children learn it in school as if it's history. Yeah, that he was a child, and his father was a merchant of idols, and the child already realized that these idols are nothing, and he went around smashing them to show how helpless they are. You know, I can smash them to bits, and his father hauls him up to court, to Nimrod, for execution, basically. That's the story. And he's thrown into the fire, indeed. So he initiates his life in fire, according to this fantasy, quote unquote. Did this really happen? What is this? According to this, that's how he began his life, and he was saved miraculously. Yarediti v'nitzalti. I went right down into the thick of it, into death, and I was saved. If God has done this for me twice, then maybe I have no merit left. To anything I could have done to deserve those salvations has been all used up. There's nothing and now I'm left with nothing for Olam Haba. When you really need merit, that's when it's important for the world to come. And God then says to him, I think God is gently laughing at him. He says to him, everything I've done for you up to now is for free. Chinam. I didn't draw on your resources. I didn't look for payment in your merits. So you go with the fullness of who you are into Olam Haba. It seems to me maybe slightly mocking. Not mocking is not the right word, but God is correcting Abraham's rather rudimentary sense of having credits, and you tear off the coupons, and it's just very, very pragmatic, very actual. That really what's meant by that is you've made yourself into a certain kind of person, and that kind of person can both deserve to be saved in this world. It's not a matter of how many coupons you have, both in this world and to be left who you are. At the same time, I think there's something in the image, in Abraham's image, but I won't follow that up. But it's a very natural, in a way, childlike image, and child images shouldn't be dismissed. They have something. At any rate, there is Abraham's mitpached moments, his anxiety moments, and how they are resolved by God. Then the second passage, just to show that this carries on after the Akedah, right to the end of the parsha. In the passage after the Akedah, where Abraham receives news from back home in Haran about the birth in his family there, the birth of a young girl called Rivka. And that's put in as the end of the parsha. It's a kind of strange follow-on from the Akedah. What's the connection between the almost killing of Yitzchak and the fact that Rivka has been born? There's a mate there for Yitzchak, and the movements of providence, a sense of providential. And here Rashi doesn't talk about it from the point of view of God. Look how God manages things. First he saves Yitzchak from slaughter, and then not only that, but he's prepared a wife for him. But rather through the mind of Abraham. We're not so much interested in God's mind here, we're interested in Abraham's mind. Abraham hayam meharher, there's that word. Not mitpached, but meharher. He was, the two words that I think in English express this are he had qualms or he had misgivings. He's always having misgivings. That is, the obvious good news is good news. But underneath good news, there's always a fear of some kind. That's the bad fairy, in the fairy tales. The bad fairy always turns up just when you have things really, really jolly.
You have to have a giving to have a misgiving.
Sorry?
There has to be a giving to have a misgiving.
Yeah, yes, that's right. So there's that sense of risk, of exposure. And so what do we have here? This time he doesn't say, would you say? He says, ilu, if. That's another, the word for that is a counterfactual. Yes, that term. Counterfactual, where you think of an alternative history to the history that you actually had. What would have happened if? What kind of act of mind is that? Counterfactual, or what they call it, a hypothetical. Yeah, it's certainly a very creative mind. Or is it a destructive mind? A mind that destroys joy and meaning by creating trouble at every point? What do we have here? If my son had been slaughtered by now, he would have gone without children. Oy, what almost happened? I should have. That's the those are the promptings of guilt. I should have married him off well before the Akedah ever happened. In some way, I was remiss because look what almost happened. I would have been responsible for it. That's a certain way of thinking, and one can have very different responses to it. If we opened this up, I think it would be very interesting, but I perhaps will bring things up at the end if you're interested. I mean, personally, I feel on the one hand that is the way of thinking of someone who is prone to guilt, who's never satisfied, who overthinks, who's always in a way destroying simple happiness, the obvious meaning of things, and always pushing at it, to find yes, but surely that is a complex mind. That's a mind that is open to the hirhurim that are there in the atmosphere. It's not only in you that these hirhurim live. They live in the minds of others. They live in the mind of God as well. We'll see as we go on. So here Abraham is meharher. He says, I should have married him off. And then God sends him the good news that Rivka has been born. So you see that your worries are not necessary. But it seems that Abraham has to go through this process before he can be reassured. He doesn't just have a sort of quiet faith in God, you might say. He's not the person of just taking things as they are. And that's what it means to say, Acharei hadvarim ha'ele. This is interesting. After these things, the news came to Abraham. This is after the Akedah. That's these things. And here, Rashi retranslates it from the Midrash. Hirhurei dvarim shehayu al yedei Akedah. These are the misgivings of words that came about through the Akedah. That is, there is this torrent of words that is unleashed in Avram by the Akedah. It's not just a fact that it almost happened, but it didn't happen, and everything is fine. Rather, there's a torrent of thoughts and words in Abraham, and they're not clear, they're rather troubled. They're constantly self-questioning. And there's something here that is regarded as this is the home territory of Abraham. This is his mind. And laying aside the question of whether it's good or bad, I don't think one needs to give grades. Maybe that's the human mind. Maybe everyone is like this, except for maybe a very few people. I don't know. I haven't done a questionnaire. But I can well imagine that most of the people one meets are thinking and rethinking, reimagining the scene that's just happened. What did I say? What should I have said that? And so on, on all kinds of levels. It's perhaps the sign of a developed individual, someone who, I don't know what else to say.
It makes him very human.
Pardon?
It makes him very human.
Yes,
To the reader.
yes. But he of all the avot is the one who is meharher. I think that's true to say, just from now. I haven't done a scientific study, but you just find this theme of hirhur, and especially now in number 3, in relation to the Akedah itself. What brought about the Akedah? It was hirhurei dvarim shahayu sham. So when the Akedah chapter 22, begins, achar hadvarim ha'ele, very similar to what we saw after the Akedah. Yeah? After these things, we're not talking only about things, we're talking about words. After the queasy words, hirhurei dvarim, the questioning words that were there. It doesn't say here that Abraham had questions, but there were questions everywhere in the atmosphere. I've always had this feeling, because look how he puts it. It's almost funny. Me here, Abraham here. So who had these thoughts? Abraham had these thoughts. So it makes these thoughts something that's just there in the atmosphere. It turns out in the course of this midrash that the angels have these thoughts, only they're criticizing Abraham. And then Yishmael has these thoughts, And Yitzchak argues with him about it. That is, all these counterfactuals are there in the atmosphere. But Abraham is a really good nurturing place for them. They really find a home in Abraham. And what was his problem? He's had a good life, he says it. Samachti v'simachti v'takol. The obvious story of my life is that I have always rejoiced and rejoiced other people. That is, I think this is reference to all the feasts that Abraham makes. He certainly makes a weaning feast for Yitzchak, but in the Midrash, he's always doing this. He's always feeding people. Remember, the door of his tent is open, and people say brachot, and he's koreh b'shem Hashem. And in other words, it's a happy hive of joyful life going on, and feeding and enjoyment. So what's wrong? Where is the hirhur? He'll find it. And he says, V'lo hifrashti lakadosh baruch hu lo parechad v'lo ayel echad. I have never separated out from all the enjoyment a ram or a bullock to sacrifice to God. To say, this is something I'm giving out from me. I'm taking it away from me. It's not something that I'm going to consume and I'm not going to enjoy it. I'm going to pass it to God. I'm going to give it to God. Not once. That's a very extreme statement, because after all, he does build altars. He really saying he never offered a sacrifice? Is that a factual statement? Or perhaps, what makes sense to me is that he means it in a very intense way. He means I've never really given up anything. All right, I may have offered, but that's not, the main thing he was doing was Vayikra b'Shem Hashem. That was his religious act. That whatever he was doing, he called out in the name of God. He declared God the source of everything. But that's not exactly a korban. And korban is really giving up. It's gritty stuff, it's really difficult stuff, not easy stuff. And then God reassures him. That's the usual dynamic of his hirhurim. Once he's worried about it, God takes him seriously. And he says, this is all with the knowledge. I have the knowledge that if we were to ask you to sacrifice your son, you would not hold back. Now that's a hypothetical. God is saying, but I know you. I don't have to test you, because I know that if I asked you, if you would not hold back your son. So I don't worry about you not sacrificing a bullock or a ram, because I know your heart. Now, these are all hypotheticals. And I don't want to read the rest. Have a look at it yourselves. Right? In the second part, the angels are critical of Abraham on the same basis. And in the third part, Yishmael and Yitzchak, I'll say it in the sentence, Yishmael says, I'm better than you. He's having a competition with Yitzchak. He says, because I allowed myself to be sacrificed, that is, circumcised. Bloody business. I allowed blood to be taken from me, and I was 13 years old. I could have stopped it. So I made a choice there. I get credit. But you were 8 days old. You don't get any credit. It was done to you. And again, the answer of Yitzchak is a hypothetical. I wish that God would ask me to, now it's really horrifying. I wish that God would ask me to sacrifice one of my limbs, to cut off one of my limbs. That in a way makes it even worse, because your imagination goes there. And then in another passage that straight afterwards, it's not on your page, God speaks for Yishmael and justifies him also. But immediately what you have after this is Miyad Elokim Nisa et Abraham. Immediately God tested Abraham. Now this is a radical midrash. Why? Because it gives us where the Akedah idea came from. Right? It's a version of the source of the Akedah idea, as if it doesn't come from God. It comes actually from God understanding Abraham's inner situation, that he needs a reality test. In some way, he's always struggling in a foggy world of, what if and if, all these hypotheticals. And what he's really asking for is a way of knowing clearly reality test, however horrifying. Now, that presumably, if you'd asked Abraham, you'd have said absolutely not. But there's something unconscious in Abraham, I can use that word. There is a desire for sacrifice because it would clarify something. And the need for clarity is a need in human. You can't have any doubt once that's happened. And so there is that miyad. When Chazal use miyad, they often mean there's a cause and effect. That why did God test Abraham? Because Abraham asked to be tested.
Doesn't it fall more on Yitzchak, the last part?
That's true. That's good, very good question. It's not Yitzchak who's being tested, it's Abraham. The Ishbitzer offers an answer, which I find quite helpful. He says, for Yitzchak, it wouldn't have been a problem. Yitzchak would have regarded it purely as a matter of obedience. He would have had no confusion in himself. It's a matter of self-sacrifice. Is one prepared to do that or not? It would have been a simpler story. But Abraham is the one who really is big, because he is the one who's going to have the struggle. Because of his background, because of the culture he comes from, right? You can already sense what we're talking about here, in which fire and sacrifice and killing of children, is simply a norm. And it's a way of making real something that the human mind wants. It's an intrinsic desire of the mind. We find ways of sublimating it. Now, we have other things that we do, but there is a desire for to be burnt up totally in fire, or to burn up one's most precious totally in fire. And I want to move into that very difficult area. This is the most difficult part of what I want to try. Yes.
It's almost reminiscent of the.
Could I ask you to speak a little louder?
Oh, sorry. It's almost reminiscent of the story of Eo.
That's absolutely, not almost, yes.
So
Yes.
instead of an outside Satan saying it,
Yes,
some
right.
say.
That is very much the same. Because there you remember it's Eof who has Hirhurim. He has annual feasts for his family. Welcome. And then he sacrifices a burnt offering to atone for Hirhurim Shebalev, to atone for his own misgivings. Why is he having this party and these sacrifices? In case one of my family cursed God in his heart. So there's a hypothetical. It's a kind of horrifying hypothetical that really someone in my family may have had a moment of exasperated anger at life. We shouldn't think of it as something so unusual. People do that. In one way or another, they destroy meaning. They do something in their hearts. Let's get this clear. Don't want to know about this. And in case there had been that, so there is something of the same structure of yes. But where do we go now? Let's have a look in. We're not going to move on to the next source just now. I want to go into this passage in which we look at some of the implications of fire. And I have two French philosophers to help me. So it's going to be a certain kind of study. The French philosophers are a breed of their own, which I always found very interesting and really fascinating. One is Bachelard, who is fascinated by images, by imagery. One book about water and dreams, one book about air and dreams, what he calls material images, matter, and its implications. When he discusses fire, he has a whole book on it, The Psychoanalysis of Fire, a thin book. He says this. He says, fire smolders in a soul more surely than it does under ashes. And what he's saying is something it moves us along. It's generative. You might think fire is fire is fire. Everyone knows what fire is. And it's there, basically, we think of the human need for fire. Of course, we need to be heated up, we need warmth, and we need fire for cooking. You know, and these are very real concrete needs. That's the beginning of the story, but that's not the whole story. It's not even the most important part of the story for him. What's more important is the torrent of words that powerful image of fire unleashes in us. What does it make us think of? What are the associations? For instance, the thinker, you know, the classic posture of the thinker who sits in front of the hearth, he says, watching the fire burning up the log. You know, what is there to look at so much? You know what fire does. Oh, until you've looked, you don't know. You've really looked in detail. Seen the little ants, little white ants crawling around the log that throw themselves into the flames. For instance, he quotes from George Sand, French novelist and essayist, thinker, who tells the story of a traveler who is traveling to a volcano to see the volcano on Mount Etna. And he spends the night in an inn on the slopes of the mountain because he wants to see the sunset in the morning. So he's all prepared for a great experience, aesthetic experience of fire, which will be overwhelming in its majesty and beauty and terror, but you keep well away from it. You keep well away from the sparks. And in the inn, there is a fire burning in the hearth, and he sits and meditates in front of the fire and watches those little ants, those little moths that throw themselves into the fire. And this is the way Bachelard describes it. He says, what is fire? What does it represent when it smolders in the soul? Right? We have fire in our souls, for the good and for the bad. It's really not an ethical question. It's just a fact. And what are the associations here? He says fire represents the desire to change, to speed up the passage of time, to bring all life to its conclusion, to its hereafter. In a way, to consume and consummate everything. That everything should in a way disappear, and there will be just one fine, glorious flame at the end, and all particular beings will disappear into that fire, into the apotheosis of that fire. Now, I feel uncomfortable when I have to say, when I talk about these things, because, you know, when did I last want to throw myself into the fire? And I'm not aware that that's something, but unconsciously there's something there which I want to persuade you of. You know, let's take, I think for Bachelard, what he's really saying without ever being explicit is that all our associations are drawn from our erotic life. Of our love, our sense of love and life on the one hand and death on the other. And that, for instance, there is a desire in our erotic lives to disappear, to be burned up in one moment, at the moment of consummation. Yes. I always hope that other people will recognize what I'm talking about. Okay, let's just assume that we all do. Otherwise, you're really embarrassing me. That there is that desire to stop being me, to merge with the other, and not only with the other, with the world, to disappear. If I really want to embarrass myself, I would say it's a very spiritual moment. You know, it's in my experience, right? Not always, but yeah, you know what I mean, perhaps. Now, here, what is the traveler doing? Again, quoting Bachelard, he says what he's doing is the soul is united with elements of the volcano and the hearth. He looks at this little fire in the thing, and suddenly he realizes that from a point of view of those little moths, it's a volcano. Mm-hmm. So scale disappears, and there's suddenly this imaginative movement into the volcano right here. And that self-sacrificial desire, that desire to, and somewhere to get in contact with that. Now, when he sees the actual volcano in the morning, he may not be aware of that at all. He'll look at it aesthetically, and he'll think, oh, very, very interesting, you know, very beautiful. But by looking at it in the hearth, he has an intimate sense of an intimate desire. It's a very a very inward desire. It goes against all the externalized desires that we have in our lives. I want things. And that's the theme of the second philosopher, Georges Bataille, Bataille, in his theory of sacrifice. Now, it's called the theory of religion, and a section is on sacrifice. And he has really extraordinary things to say about sacrifice, how far they're true of the Jewish concept of sacrifice. I think, if not totally, then somewhat. You know? And so I'll try to explain what he's saying very briefly. He says, most of our lives we live in a way in a world of things, in an order of things. There are things I need in order to go on living. And the things that I deal with in the world are things that will help me to go on living. I need to earn money, and then I make friends with you because that helps me in my social whatever, you know. In other words, there is an instrumental side to our lives, because our main desire is to endure, to go on holding on to life for as long as possible. And then he says, but there's another order. It's an alternative order. He calls it the order of intimacy, where one wants to lose oneself, actually. One wants to stop that kind of day after day after day, and to gain everything in one moment. To give up everything and to gain everything in one moment. Now it's a mystical notion. It's an erotic notion, right? It's not a notion for every day, but he says it does have a clarifying effect. And he has a sentence that I struggle with. I like it, but he says that kind of order of intimacy, when it happens, reveals the invisible brilliance of life. That there is an intensity to life, if I can use that word instead of brilliance. You know, there's an intensity to life that we blind ourselves to, that we don't allow ourselves to think too much, because we really need to take it day by day, and we need to just go on living. There is that very important desire, but there is a counter desire as well, which has to do with fire. And presumably, in a good life, there is a good interweaving of the two desires, that we find ways, symbolic ways, of in one moment gaining a world. There are high moments, there are sublime moments, there may be very low moments as well. Now, that sense of the desire for that kind of intensity, again, a sentence from him, which I like. He says that intimate order is a world of violent and uncalculated generosity, where you will give away everything in the moment. You know, you won't count out your dollar bills and say, you know, peel off a little bit and say, well, I'll give you this, and I'll give you that, and I'll keep this for me, and so on. Instead, you just have it. But that impulse, you know, you see it in the Eastern religions. Doesn't have to be sacrifice in the sense of blood. I saw it at Amritsar, if you've been to the Golden Temple of Amritsar, which is a monotheistic, it's a Sikh temple religion, where people were throwing money, right, indiscriminately, not into the fire, into the center of the circle, where there are rose petals, and a sense somewhere of just giving off, giving away. Something, what's left is a clarity. What's left is a kind of less surface to me and more inwardness. Not so clear who I am. I am intimately now connected with life itself, with not only with one other person, but with life itself. And that's a rare experience, but a very worthwhile experience. If one has it, it's worth quite a lot. In my mind, the Talmudic story that gives us this notion of why that is desirable, that sacrificial mode, is a story told of Elazar ben Dordea. It's in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Yud Zayin Aleph. Yes. He's a well-known libertine, our hero. There's no lady of easy virtue that he hasn't entertained. And there's this particular lady who's really good, and he comes with lots of silver and gold. He really knows how to spend when it comes to this. He knows how to, without question. And then there's this little embarrassing moment when he breaks wind. Is that the expression? I must be getting old because I don't even blush when I say it now. He breaks wind, and the lady says, "Ooh, this wind will more easily go back to your body, return to your body, than you will ever return to God. You are really far gone. You're the real thing." And immediately he has a desperate desire to do tshuva. One of these extreme stories, of which there are many, especially around there in Avodah Zarah. A sudden, an absolute desire. And he nothing can help him. He looks everywhere for help. How is he going to manage to do tshuva? And then in the end, he almost really, he wills himself to death in the ecstasy of desire. He puts his head between his knees and he bellows. The ga'a b'fchiyah. It's almost like an animal cry. Well, I don't want to be this thing anymore. And his soul flies away. And a voice comes out from the heavens and says, "Rabbi Elazar," he's now become a rabbi, is welcome into the life of the world to come. Now that's a royal welcome he gets. When Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the rabbi who found the teacher of Torah Shebal Peh, of the oral law, the Mishnah, when he hears the story, he weeps. I find this just such an extraordinary story. So everyone's crying in this story. You have the sinner who's crying, and you have the tzaddik who's crying. But what's he crying about? And he says, "Yesh shekoneh olamo b'kama shanim, v'yesh shekoneh olamo b'sha'a achat." There are two ways of being. One is that you work solidly at endurance, day after day, the ethical life, the self-restrained life, trying to make a mensch of yourself, somewhere to restraint is asked for. And then you become Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. But he admits that there is this other modality as well. In one instant, Sha'ah Achat is not an hour. It's an instant. It's an instantaneous, passionate moment in which, in a way, it goes against the grain but where do we have that? Right? We have, for instance, the Gemara in Ketubot saying, the idea is, you're supposed to cling to God. You're supposed to have a kind of intimacy with God. But how can you have an intimacy with fire? The Gemara says. God is a burning fire. Quotes from Devarim also. Hashem esh ochla. God is a consuming fire. So how can you get close in that sense of, embrace God? And the answer that's given is that if you marry your daughter to a Talmid Chacham, so that his life, in a way you're helping to support his life, then you are clinging to God. Not to God, but to God's ways. In other words, you're translating or sublimating the desire for the moment, because it's too dangerous to try to cling to the divine. And you're translating it into the life of every day. The life of marriage, the life of finance. The other example that's given, help the Talmid Chacham with his financial enterprises. So there's something of that really bringing it down to earth. And that very clearly is on the side. It's not on the side, it's against the side of fire. It's, in other words, saying our way is not the way of fire. We don't go to those extreme modes. So I suggest that it's not quite as simple as that. That's one source, but that it's possible to think a little differently. And with this, let's think about Avram's relation to fire very quickly. I'm not going to follow it rigorously, but just to point out that several times in Avram's life, when he's experiencing things, an image of fire comes up in his mind. Now, that's again turning our attention not to what really happens, but to what he sees when he looks at it. As if to say, and that's what we tried to say last week as well, that the difference between Avraham's subjectivity and the facts out there, right, which we always think exists. There is my mind and the way I imagine things, and then there is the truth out there. There is the subject and there's the object. It seems that certainly when it comes to Avraham, there is a blurring of that separation. That what really matters is how Avraham sees it. Avraham creates, right? He creates the souls of other people. How? By seeing them as in a certain way. That has a dynamic effect in the world. So that Abraham is going through things as an object of God's creation, right? He's a human being and God has made him. And how did God make him? With an ability to make others, to imagine the lives of others into reality, into a certain reality, as well as his own life. So when Abraham, for instance, starting with Sodom, Abraham is praying for Sodom. He says, Anochi afar ve'efer. This is a very powerful source. Have a look at your page, number 4. I am just dust and ashes. Who am I to plead before you? Who am I to argue with you? And Rashi strangely pays attention to the image there, afar ve'efer, which for us is, what we call a dead metaphor, dust and ashes. But Abraham created it. Where did he get it? Why did those expressions come to his mind? And this is how Rashi from the Midrash puts it. I should already have been. Another hypothetical. I should already have been dust at the hands of the kings and ashes at the hand of Nimrod, Kivsham ha'esh, ashes from the fire. Lule rachamecha asher amduli. If it had not been for there is that hypothetical. If God's mercy had not stood for me, that expression, amduli, that was my spine. So God's rachami. What he's saying through the hypothetical, he's saying, I should have been, but in the Torah, he's saying, Anochi, I am dust and ashes. It's not so simple to dismiss the image and say, well, it's a metaphor. In some real meaning, he is dust and ashes. Certainly ashes. That's the image we're focusing on. That if you've been down into the fire and you've been saved, then there are always ashes left. There's always something, we call it post-traumatic. But there's something in Abraham that knows about ashes and knows about the fire intimately. He's lost his self, at least for that split second. He was in the fire, and it wasn't a happy experience, obviously. So that's one example of fire for him, and not as Chazal seem to read it. Secondly, when Sodom is burning, he sees it as Kitor haaretz lapid esh. Kitor haaretz, kitor hakivshan. He looks at the burning city of Sodom, and the pillar of fire, smoky pillar that's rising up, is like the smoke of a furnace, of a kivshan, using the actual word. In other words, these are the words that arise in it's the image and the words that arise in his mind when he looks at Sodom burning. That's his image. You can't say it is like a fire. It seems to me like a fire. That's his construction of it. And there's something, and this is an idiom of his most intimate life. Fire lives there, the experience of fire. And with that, I want to go to the Kivshan Ha'esh itself and the central source here, number 5. is there anything in the Torah that could generate these words, fiery furnace? Is there any source at any moment in the Torah that you can plausibly say in some way, well, that refers to the Kivshana Ish? And Rashi finds it. And he finds it in a midrash that, if I'm not mistaken, he really constructs himself. He uses the material that is there in midrashic sources, but it has his stamp on it. There's an originality about it. Before Lech Lecha, before God first addresses Abraham.
What source are we?
Number 5. We read that Haran, who is Avram's brother, died al pnei terach aviv. He died in the presence of Terach, his father. That's a strange expression. And why would the son die in the presence of his father? That seems to have a story. You know, your words start, the torrent of words start here. So Rashi says, well, the pshat would be b'chaye aviv. In the presence of his father means while his father was still alive, which already, you know, generates that torrent. Why? What's the story? Why does a son die before his father? It's not the usual mode of generations. And the Midrash Haggadah takes it much further. Al Yidei Aviv met. Now that's, I haven't found a source for that, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but he died at the hands of his father. Now that's intimate. His father killed him. Haran. Why? And here's where the Kivshana Ish finds its roots in the text. Because when Terach complained about Avram, his son, to Nimrod for smashing his idols, they threw him into Kivshan Ha'esh. They threw him into this fiery furnace. Haran was sitting there, and he said in his heart, right? He was thinking this through. And he said to himself, if Avram comes out alive, I'm his. I'll be on his side. And if he dies, I will be on Nimrod's side. So he is being very common sense. And he sees that Avram comes out alive, and he says, I'm on Avram's side, and he is not saved. Who is to blame for this? So Rashi says, well, ultimately, the father. Why? Because the father wanted to kill Avram. But Avram was saved, so he didn't actually kill Avram. Haran was actually killed by his father, because of what happened, even though the father didn't mean to kill him. So there's meaning and act. In the case of Avram, there was a meaning to kill him, which didn't go through. In the case of Haran, it actually went through, even though he didn't mean it. In both cases, then, you have Avram emerging from such an event, knowing that his father actually killed his brother, that it's in the family, filicide is in the family, that it's close to home, and that really his father wanted to kill him, which is filicide in the heart. That's the impulse. And he comes out of the despair and ugliness of that understanding. Basically, he's unfathered, as well as perhaps one could add a certain sense of guilt himself in relation to his brother, that in some way he is responsible for his brother's death. And it's also, in other words, it's a complex. If you talk about an Oedipal complex, or this is a complex that Avram comes from, and it's a complex that comes from the whole culture. It's there in the families of the society of the ancient Near East. It's there everywhere. It's there in the caves, forecasting. See something about that. Rashi, in the same passage, yes, right there, at the end of the passage, he asks, what does the word ur mean? Most obviously, he quotes a contemporary grammarian. He often relies on him. Ur Kasdim. First of all, he says ur is fire. He was burned in fire. That's ur Kasdim. But then he quotes Menachem, who translates ur in a way we never would have known to translate it. Bik'ah, a pit. I think it's more than a valley. Becca, It's a deep pit of some kind. And he has a proof text from Yeshayahu, and yes, from Yeshayahu. Any hole, any cavity and crevice, deep crevice, is called an ur. And an ur is a sinister place, a great pit in which sacrifices are made to the gods. And ur is a hidden place, it's a dark place in which horrors are. And that is what occupies Abraham's imagination. That's what he knows God wants him not to live. And he knows that God has saved him exactly from that. It's not just the fire, it's the fire of that kind of culture, that sort of culture. And it obsesses him, right? It's there throughout his life. It's something, because he's engaged in it. He wasn't passive entirely. He was passive, but he had an effect on the drama. And his brother died as a result of it. So he's involved here. A little digression, which I hope will prove worthwhile. Number 6. Not such a digression, but let's touch on it anyway. When God said to Avram, Lech lecha, what is written just above? Terach died in Haran. So it seems that his father Terach died at the end of Parshat Noach, and then God said, Lech lecha, now leave. But Rabbi Yitzchak says, if you do a reckoning, you do the arithmetic, you'll find that Terach had 65 more years to live when Avram left her. I'm not sure how you do that arithmetic, but that's the assertion. So how do you account for that? And says this, Abraham was mefached. There he is, doing it again. Yeah. Abraham was afraid. In this case, it's just afraid. And he said, if I do this, if I follow the command of this God and go and start a whole new religion, you know, this fire that's calling me now just to go out into the world, then I will be mechalel shem shamayim. I will be profaning God's name. Why? Because of kibbud av va'em. People, what he's been teaching is ethics, and a basic principle of ethics is to look after your aged parents, to take care of them. And he left his aged father and followed the light, that's a pagan kind of practice there. And so, what can I do about this? I'm having trouble with that. And God reassures him very strangely. He says, Lecha ani potercha mikibud av. I absolve you from the need to honor your father. No one else. It remains a universal command, not just for Jews, but you, and doesn't explain it. And I can only think that this is an intertextual reference. So everyone knows that midrash about the Or custom, that whether it happened or not, it's something in Avram's mind. It didn't happen in his family, it happened in other families. Right? It's there that exists. It exists on some level in the atmosphere. And if that was how his father was to him, then his father unfathered him. Right? He doesn't deserve kibbud av va'em. Now, this has all kinds of problems associated with it, but the idea is very significant, that it has halachic implications. What Abraham lives with in relation to his father is a sense that he doesn't have a father, that his father really abdicated that role. And that's how a new religion could start. It starts, that's a motif in the origins of many religions. The originator, Romulus and Remus, and the originator doesn't come from a normal, family background of some kind. The midrash that I really wanted to, yes, number 9. This is the Yeshidoch. Yes. Talking about the Tower of Babel seemed to be a real digression. Let me try to summarize this. Notices that when they build their tower that's supposed to reach the heavens. They build it in a valley, in a deep place. It's called Shinar. And so the common sense question is,
Why would you go?
why not start on a high mountain if you want to go high?
Yeah.
And then he comes to this extraordinary surrealistic image, which really sets torrents of words going. He says they built it on a mountain of corpses in this low valley. These are the corpses, excuse me, this is a horror story. These are the corpses that were thrown down by the flood. The flood was a surge, Mabul, Hovil. All the corpses of all the deaths came down to that lowest place in the world. This is the pits at the bottom of the world. And where did they choose to base their new civilization, which is supposed to reach the heavens? On death, on the terror of God, on the fear of another Mabul, that we have to appease God, and we have to sacrifice to God, and we have to, right? In a way, it's crowning the deity in terror. And Meir Shiloh then says, after he's constructed this, suggestive scenario.
Number 7, right?
Yes, number 7, yes. He says, is that like the Beit HaMikdash, for instance? No, it's just the opposite. The Beit HaMikdash was also a place where we, tried to reach God. It's the opposite of the Beit HaMikdash, which is what God wants. Because the Beit HaMikdash is higher than the whole world. It's built on a mountain. And all Israel unite themselves there and crown God there. Whereas in the Tower of Babel, all human beings unite themselves there. Safa Achat. They're unified with solidarity, but it's a solidarity of terror. And here, alternatively, there's a solidarity of what he calls avodah, of work. Now, avodah can mean the rituals and the sacrifices, the avodah of the Beit HaMikdash, but it's the idea of work. It's the idea of trying to move upwards, not to define one's civilization by terror, not to define it by the terror of the worst things that you can possibly think about being alive and about the nature of other people and so on. That is a forced unity. That's a solidarity. That's a compulsive solidarity. That's what you find in communist regimes, as someone pointed out in last night's class. So this herself comes from Russia. And with the lies that God looks for something that is high, which means in somewhere in the light, and constantly working. There's a constant process in which people are trying to become more and more realized, more and more not in the pit. The pit. I don't know if you have this association, but there is a very real theological discovery of what's called the Great Pit of Ur. The death pit of Ur, the great death pit of Ur, which is, well, I continue the horror here. It was discovered in Mesopotamia. It goes back to 2600 BCE, very, very ancient. And this is the ancient pagan practice of burying the king or the queen and all the courtiers, the live courtiers, with the king and the queen, as well as silver and gold and ornaments and so on. And so a large number of people are killed, are sacrificed in the death rituals. And then they find this, they discover this. Yes. This is a kind of rubbish dump. Became that place in which they would throw the garbage. The sense of total devaluing of human life. and the desperate desire to please some deity or others. If these servants, perhaps there's a suggestion they were drugged into some kind of ecstasy that would allow them to submit to this. That is quite a plausible suggestion. In other words, how do they go? Alternatively, it's the drug of fantasy. It's the drug of partly power. You can't struggle, but also willing oneself into acceptance, as if that represents some ecstatic, fiery beauty of some kind. And the Meshach wants to say that exists in us, and the opposite exists in us. And the opposite is the Beit HaMikdash and Avodah. The desire to grow up from that place, to leave that place. And if you want to see a geological metaphor for that, I won't read it with you. Look at number 9a. Now I want to very quickly come back to the Akedah. So it's with this that Avram comes to the Akedah. Comes with many thoughts, as the Ishbitzer says, as the Yeshua says. De'ot u'machshavot shonot. Different thoughts. Is it this or is it that? Why did God not just say shachtem, if that's what he meant? Slaughter him, if that's what he meant. What does God really want? Is that really God? And there are midrashim that actually enact some of these troubled thoughts. For instance, again, I'll just direct you, number 9b, if you want to read it. Satan mixes Abraham up by raising the question, do you think that was God who told you that? That was Satan. Now, once you've really turned things upside down like that, so where is Abraham? Abraham is looking for clarity. He's looking for something real in all this. And he's just about to go ahead and do it. And we don't know what is in his mind when he decides to do it. He's just about to do it. We'd like to think that he's doing it out of good motives, but that Meir Shiloh opens up other possibilities. And then the angel, God, calls out just at the last minute, you remember, not God, not the absolute, but an angel who is, I would say, a kind of transitional being. He's a messenger between God and the human being, both ways. In other words, he belongs to the human life as much as he belongs to the absolute. He is part of Abraham as well as part of God. It's the angel. And when he calls out, Abraham, Al tishlach yadcha el hanar, don't lay hands on the boy and don't do anything to him. Al ta'as lo mu'umma. On which Rashi comments that Abraham said, but just a scratch. In other words, there is that desire, at least symbolically, just a little mark. And the answer is, mu'umma mum. Don't make a blemish on him. That for you, it may feel like some satisfaction to make a little scratch, satisfying the fire. No, for me, that would be a blemish that would destroy the sacrifice. The sacrifice can only be if you don't, if you move back at this point. But when the angel calls in this way, he calls with a little line between the two Abrahams. And the Zohar wonderfully reads the little line, and it says, Avraham Harishon lo haya kamo Avraham Hasheni. That the Avraham whom the angel first talks to is not the same Avraham as the second call. That Avraham crucially changes. He wakes up from the trance. The religious trance, let's just put it like that, right? We can call it judgmentally the pathology of the religious imagination, if you want to be very clear about it. I prefer not to be too clear about it, about the ethics side, but somewhere simply as a fact that Avraham also knew about this, coming from where he came from, that there is a real mevucha here. How do you become a God-fearing person rather than simply a person of terror? So it's two very different things. And so when the first time that Abraham hears the call, the Kliyakar, one of the classic commentaries with the Hasidic background, says rather wonderfully, he couldn't hear the first call because he was tarud b'mitzvah. It's wonderful. I think it's an anti-Litvish. It's a Hasidic comment. After I'll explain. It's because tarud b'mitzvah is to be distracted by all the details of getting the mitzvah right. You know, that exactly have to chew through the right amount of matzah, you know, and Pesach night, and you know, it's very serious.
The shorish.
Tarud is to be wearied by something. Tarud,
And it's
a
trouble.
burden.
Trouble.
Trust, yeah.
Yeah.
Trust. But it's a halakhic and valued concept that it's hard work to do a mitzvah properly. You know, so
It's positive, it's very positive.
it's positive. But for him, it's not. You know, for him, he's getting a little, he's singing, so he can't even hear when the angel calls. And then he gives another possibility, which is even worse, you know, it's even more. And he says that he, not only that he couldn't hear, but he didn't want to hear. But there is, and the expression he uses is, yes, asa atzmo k'ish nidham.
Wow.
Incredible. He made himself like a person in trance. To translate nidham. I would think that's exactly right. That he is in a trance and there's something willful about it.
That,
You know,
that
that
lines
you-
up with the idea that it was the Satan.
Pardon?
I said it lines up with the idea that it was the Satan.
So, you know, it's complex till the last minute. The only thing is that the second time the angel cries, he's woken himself up. And last week we talked about the awakenings, you know, in a more positive field. We talked about that as the mode of his life, awakening people from some kind of passivity and sleep and stupor and so on. This is it in the most excruciating and intimate way. And that's to wake from paganism, to wake from the desire, from the inside of that way of being, and then to hear what the angel is calling. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
I'll help it.
Pardon?
Yeah, last. One about the instrumental of time, the instrumental versus
I
the
can't hear you.
song. In the world of things versus the world of intimacy and love, that idea of batai. So it contrasts sacrifice with the intimate loving yourself. It seemed like a step of taking Hooper another step. With the Avivah.
I'm assuming.
Yeah, you're sorry. I'm sorry, my notes are so bad.
No.
Sacrifice within a world of things and instrumental, but then there's another intimate order.
Yeah.
And we give up everything, we want to have intensity, it just reminded me.
Thank you so much.
Oh, the Avivah, yes, there is a concept.
It's like he said,
Yes.
he took it another
Yes.
step.
Except
Hooper
that he
wouldn't have
doesn't talk
talked
about
about that.
sacrifice. He doesn't talk about it in a second.
Hooper.
Hoover.
Yeah, I was thinking he wouldn't have taken it to that.
No, he wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
It's,
but
beautiful, clear handwriting.
I always think of it as Ruthie and Granny, all in one.
Thank you for that.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm sorry we came in a little late. You know Priya, right? My daughter.
Sure, recognize it.
How are you doing? I'm good.
How's the Sam?
She's in the army right now, but she had in the army, but she has a day off. So,
What do you
You
do?
were doing a special job.
Yeah, I'm in Nativ, which is the
Yes,
conversion
yes.
process.
It's good work.
Most of the time.
Are they mostly Russians?
A lot of Ethiopians also.
Ethiopians now, of course, who's Russian, like, yeah.
Russian,
Russians are fully
Ukrainian,
integrated,
Ethiopian,
yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so we have a day together, which is nice.
So nice.
Thank you
It's a
so
nice way to
much.
spend it.
All right, so I will let you know. Okay.
Nice seeing you. Thank you.
I was thinking actually that when we met, this was, I was younger, like by a year or two than Priya is now.
We go way back.
Yeah, so say hello to all your people.
How is everyone?
Oh, really?
My sister's okay.
So intense.
right.
The,
And is
I was,
everybody
at the
okay?
end, you used the word willful or willfulness, and it does seem as though there's something in
Yeah,
there.
there's so many different forms of saying it.
Especially if a person has been struggling with something so long, it's like, I've just got to do whatever that, and in this case, the turn to the fire is like, or the giving up everything. He really was giving up everything. That's why realizing that Yitzchak wouldn't be here to have children, that would be, was, well, he was so on the verge of giving up everything.
I have a,
Yes.
my sister for you guys.
The feeling I have is that in some way,
You have a few?
Oh, my gosh.
He decides not to do it.
That's right.
It's my God tells
Not
us.
that many, right? Yeah.
Because the mother is
That, yeah.
yeah, you can't say
Well,
absolutely
I'm just
clearly that
visiting,
he,
so I'm staying by Sarah.
I'm saying, Sarah.
And I'll
Sure,
be
how
home
you
next
do
week,
it.
I'll be in
you know,
Toronto.
it was
Are
God's
they on Cherokee?
decision.
Yeah.
Stop.
I mean, I.
Yeah.
You know, that's a kind
It
of
was
very
in-
way of reading. But it's not that, he's ready for that.
There's a message, a
Yes.
messenger.
Yes, there's a messenger and to know that he
Yeah, oh, you were a little.
gets through.
Yeah,
everything when
he was
he's
He was a doctor.
Big
Right.
doctor.
And was he the one who was into like,
Right,
Confessions of a
alternative
medical
type
hair
things?
sickness. is what-
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
which I think happens at a couple of points in his life. I mean, there are messengers that come just after he's circumcised.
So, no, because I'm just very into all that, like stuff, like,
That was a pretty radical act, circumcised, and then, okay, but that's going to open up everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There.
And
And
the day
now it's
after-
becoming more and more.
That was one of the few doctors
So,
who-
yeah, beautiful.
It's lovely to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Oh, the part at the beginning reminded me of reading so much about the soldiers who have to just go do it and encounter the fire, and the enemies are going to laugh at you, and the enemies are going to, and yes, God's protection. It's kind of at a more worldly level than.
Yes, but I do think there's something
Yeah.
in the. I think there's also a truth that if the world, there are people in the world who are genuinely innocent, troubled by what we're doing. And we need to, if we don't have good answers for them, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, that's
You
what I
can't just say, oh, who cares what they think? They don't know, they don't. Some people are well intentioned. And it is, if there are problems, we should recognize it.
And well, the whole idea of an ethical army
Yes.
has been so foreign to most of the world, most of its
Yeah.
history.
Yeah,
And so we're trying to do that, but that means we have to answer on a rational
and that
level.
means we have to have qualms, we have to sort of
That's right.
question ourselves.
That's right, that's right. Which it seems like most of the, from my outside perspective and not understanding
Yeah.
even the language in which all this is carried on. It seems like we're doing pretty well by the world standards,
Yeah,
but
I hope so.
there's always,
Yeah, it's a salutary,
Pardon?
it's a salutary.
Yeah.
Input
Yes.
on some level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All right.
So up to them.
Avivah?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Ronnie Averick. I'm just visiting.
What's your name?
Ronnie Averick, just visiting. But I just wanted to tell you, so years ago, when I was in my twenties, I lived in Israel. And I